I hope everyone had a good weekend and stayed safe. I know the COVID cases are spiking. So I spent a lot of time on the DAP accelerator stuff this weekend, and so I didn't spend as much time on the Casper stuff, but I thought we could go over a kind of a notion of consensus in a social network setting that might be of interest to folks. I want to stop right at 7:30, so I have a little bit of time before the dev stand up. So this is kind of bite-sized. So if that's okay with everyone, I'll just do that.
Yeah, that sounds good.
So let's imagine that we've got a social graph that looks something like this. The characters are taken from Dan Harmon's Community. The arrows are bidirectional because they're sort of like friends connections on Facebook as opposed to following connections. What we want to do is we want to calculate the relative esteem. So for example, how high or in what esteem does this sub-community of the whole graph hold Abed versus Pierce? Does that make sense?
Do you mean like what the relative esteem would be, or you mean
so the community is going to make a judgment about the comparison of Abed to Pierce.
Yeah, okay.
Right. So the idea is we look at the connectors X between A and Y. So we want to judge the relative esteem between Abed and Pierce, right? So we look at the connectors between Abed and Pierce, and we ask how often does the community engage with content coming from Abed versus how often the community engages content coming from Pierce. Does that make sense? So we look at the frequency between so if X is a connector between Abed and Pierce, so let's give an example. Annie is a connector between Abed and Pierce. Oh, I think there's one more arrow missing. There is, yes. Sorry. Because it should be for this example, I'm using a completely connected graph. There we go. Sorry about that. Okay. So Annie is a connector between Abed and Pierce. And what we want to measure is how frequently Annie engages content from Abed versus how frequently Annie engages content from Pierce. And then we want to do that for all of the different connectors, right? So we're going to sum over all of the different connectors, right? So it turns out that Troy is also a connector between Abed and Pierce. Oh, looks like I'm missing even more arrows. Hang on a second. There we go. Okay, finally. Troy is a connector between Abed and Pierce, obviously, right? I can get to Pierce from Abed through Troy, and Shirley is a connector between Abed and Pierce. So I can get to Pierce from Abed going through Shirley. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, but I wonder, like in this case, you also have the Annie to Shirley connection. Does that make a difference, even though it's not a direct connect? I mean, she has a direct connect between Abed and
Yeah, we're only
Pierce.
looking at the direct connectors, not the lengthy paths.
Okay.
Because in a graph like this, you could go around loops. So we're just looking at the direct connectors. You could include these other ideas, but we're just looking at this direct notion.
Yeah, I guess we could take a view that basically we prefer direct connections, or we use that primarily. And where direct connections are missing, we may be willing to pay attention to the indirect connections or something. But
right, exactly.
Yeah.
So that gives you the relative esteem. And then
okay, so I think I have another question related to that. So let's suppose we're only taking direct connections, but how about the quality of the connections? For example, even though Annie has a direct connection to both Abed and Pierce, she disagrees with Pierce most of the time and agrees with Abed a lot of the time.
That's exactly what we're measuring.
Okay. How do you measure that without knowing the content?
No, you don't have to know the content. You only have to know whether she picks it up. If she disagrees, if she's very engaged with Pierce, even though she disagrees, we don't look at that. We're not worried about agreement. We're only worried about engagement.
Okay.
So that's essentially, so like if Annie disagreed with Pierce, but she didn't hold him in esteem, then she wouldn't bother to pick up his arguments.
I mean, I'm thinking like maybe engagement is a more direct way of saying it rather than esteem. But we can continue with that. I mean,
sure.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. So
we're measuring engagement. We're not measuring esteem.
Sort of. Again, for people that you're not interested in talking to, who are not worth your time, you don't engage.
Yeah.
Whether you agree or not. Okay. So the point is that we look at the ratio, right? So we look at the ratio of how much Annie engages with Abed versus how much Annie engages with Pierce. And then and then we sum up over those over all the possible connections, right? So we look at the relative esteem with Pierce, the relative esteem with Troy, the relative esteem with Shirley, and the relative esteem with Annie. And that will give you an esteem for Abed, which is not relative, right? It's summed up over all of his immediate community. And then, what that means, though, is that we have certain parameters for this graph, for these calculations. The first is, as an input to the system, we need the graph. So you've got to give me a G. So my calculation is parameterized in G. It's parameterized in A. So in this case, Abed. So A is one of the agents. And then it's also parameterized in some duration, right? So when we look at frequency, we have to look at frequency over some period of time, right? Over some duration. And you can measure that in lots of different ways. It doesn't have to be wall clock time, but it does have. You do have to have a notion of duration in order for frequency to be well defined. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. If you also add a context, then you're basically getting into liquid democracy territory.
Well, I don't know what a context is.
Well, I'm saying, for example, let's say for financial advice, Annie or Abed comes up as a higher esteem metric. But let's suppose for healthcare, Pierce comes out as a higher esteem metric. So that this is kind of where the liquid democracy folks, their thing is that you can choose different people that you trust for different domains or different contexts.
Yeah, the problem. So the way to get that in this setting is to vary G.
Yeah, exactly.
So
Yeah.
G becomes your context.
Yeah.
That because otherwise you have to peek into the content, and that sort of is problematic from the point of view of privacy and free speech and things like that.
Correct.
So if you want this to be content agnostic, then you have to. There's certain hoops that you have to go through. So let's just go through an example of a calculation, right? Let's see. Is this big enough for people to see?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Okay. So Abed has 4 connections. So we expect to see 4 components, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. And then in each component, we expect to see 3 ratios, right? Because we're looking at connectors. All right. So if you're going through, if you're going between Abed and Pierce, then you have to look at the path this way, the path this way, and the path that way. Does that make sense? So each relative, each comparison has to have 3 components. That's what I'm getting at. Does that make sense?
Can you repeat that? I mean, are those 2 numbers on each arrow in the respective directions? Is the word is?
That's right. It's the relative engagement. So how often Abed engages, how often Pierce engages Abed's content versus how often Abed engages Pierce's comment in duration D.
Okay.
Yeah, but the important thing is, just before we get to that, just so there are 4 friends that Abed is connected to. So there should be 4 outer components. Inside a component, how many should there be? Well, we're looking at relative. So we take 2 out of the graph. And since this is a completely connected graph, every other party is going to be a connector. So if you take 2 away from 5, you get 3. So each component of the outer sum should be a sum of 3 things. And each one of those 3 things should be a ratio. Is that making sense?
So I was trying to follow along with the graph the other day, and what might be helpful for me. So say if we focus in on one individual, Annie. So with Annie,
Well,
so
we're doing the
there's
calculation with respect to Abed. So
yeah, okay, we're using, but we have to look at Annie in order to determine the calculation for Abed. So
Sure.
Annie is connected to Pierce. So okay, so if we're using Annie,
if you're using Annie, then you're looking at the relative. You're comparing between Annie and Abed. How often does
right.
Pierce listen to Abed versus Pierce listen to Annie? How often does Shirley listen to Abed versus how often does Shirley listen to Annie? And how often does Troy listen to Abed versus Troy listening to Annie?
So the thing that I guess I'm focusing in on is the triangle, the triangle of the 3 lines. So with Abed, Pierce, and Annie, so the 3 lines that make up the triangle. So from Abed to Pierce, we have the 0.5 and 0.1, and then from Pierce to Annie, we have the 0.5 and 0.4, and then from Annie to Abed, we have the 0.8 and the 0.6. So should there be a corresponding equation with those 3 lines in the equation down below?
So the again, if we're looking at any one of these components is a sum of the ways in which some party listens to one of the two. So one of these components, I don't remember which. I have to look at the numbers. But let's look at this component here. Okay. So this component is a comparison of how often Pierce listens to Abed versus Pierce listens to Annie. Okay, so that should be 0.5 over 0.4. Did I get that right? Yeah, so I think it's this one. And then we have 0.6. Let's see. You have a 0.9 and a 0.9. So that's Troy. And then Shirley is a 0.6 versus a, which one is it?
So I'm a little confused because
Oh, I see.
I thought until now your explanation for relative esteem, just taking the direct connections, was that it's a matter of how often would Annie listen to Abed versus Pierce.
Sure.
So there should be.
And that's what these numbers are. These are the frequencies.
Well, they should be on Annie somehow, right? So you have 0.5, 0.4 with Pierce.
It's on the connections. So let's go through. Let's go through this.
Yeah, no, that's correct. It's on the connections, but I'm saying so. Annie has the 0.5, 0.4 with Pierce and a 0.6, 0.8 with Abed. And
but you have to look at the triangles, right?
yeah.
So first of all, let's just count how many triangles there are, right? So there should be 1, 2, 3, 4 big components, right? Because Abed is connected to Pierce, Troy, Shirley, and Annie. So the outer thing is all the connections, right? So that's the outer sum. What are the connections of Abed? Pierce, Troy, Shirley, and Annie. So we should have 1, 2, 3, 4. We've got 4. So now what's going on in any one of these? Okay, well, any one of these is a list of triangles. Why is that? Because it's the path, that. So, for example, if we're looking at the Abed-Annie relationship, we want to judge how frequently the ratio of when people listen, a given person listens to Annie versus when they listen to Abed. So we have to. So you can just see this is a completely connected graph. So we have 2 parties that we're reasoning about. So we take those out of the completely connected graph. How many, and since it's completely connected, how many of the remainder will be a connector between Abed and Annie? All of them. So there must be 3, right? Everyone else is a connector between Annie and Abed, right? So we're looking at the ratio between, how often Pierce listens to Abed, 0.5, versus Pierce listens to Annie. I think this is 0.5. Do we have a 0.5? 0.5? No. So it must be the 0.4 here. Then we want to look at how often Troy listens to Abed, 0.9, versus Troy listens to Annie, 0.9. So that's 0.5, 0.4, 0.9. I think I might have gotten this one wrong. Let's take a look. How often does Shirley listen to Abed versus Shirley listen to Annie? So I think this one should be a 0.3 over 0.6. Yeah, I think that's a typo. 0.3. Why did that happen? Escape. So we want that one. So that should be 3. Okay, yeah, I think that's correct. So does that make sense?
Let me make sure. Let me make sure what you're trying to do here. So let's say you're taking Troy, and you're trying to say, out of his total attention, where does he spend his attention on a relative basis among all these people? Or is that what we're trying to do here with the?
No. So let me try again. It's astonishing that this is so complicated.
Well, there are two problems here, because the numbering scheme, the way you have it, is going to be problematic in that the numbers should have a direction with them, either up or down, so that we know what.
Yeah, so I did that just by by convention.
If I could ask one question, and this might help me quite a bit. So if we look at the connection from Abed to Pierce, we have 0.5 above the line, 0.1 below the line.
Mm-hmm.
So the connection from Abed to Pierce going outward is that connection. I just want to confirm that that's 0.5, and from Pierce to Abed is 0.1.
Right. So how often Pierce listens to Abed? How often Abed listens to Pierce?
So the number on top of the line is Abed going outward to the 4 individuals, and then the number below the line is the other individuals going back to Abed.
Sort of, right? Because what we said was, how often does Pierce listen to Abed? So you could think of that as the line coming into Pierce, right? And the other one, however, whatever helps you in that regard.
Well, I'm just trying to understand that if we're just focused on Abed to Pierce, 0.5 on top, 0.1.
0.5.
I'm trying to understand what those mean.
Right. So let me say it again. 0.5 is how often in duration D, Abed engages in content from Pierce.
Okay.
This number in duration D is how often Abed engages in content from Pierce. So the top one is how often does Pierce engage in content from Abed. The bottom one is how often does Abed engage in content from Pierce.
And that method corresponds to all the others, the directions. Okay.
Yeah. So now this component here is just going to measure Abed and Annie. So what we're checking, and it's just sanity check before we look at the numbers. Sanity check in the same way that we counted that the number of components is correct. We need to check that the number of summands inside this component is correct. Now, how would we do that? Well, we know it's a completely connected graph, so everybody's connected to everybody. And what we need to do is we're measuring how frequently someone listens to Abed versus someone listens to Annie. So how many people are there that would be connectors between Abed and Annie?
So you have Troy, you have Shirley, you have Pierce.
Correct. So there's 3. You could get to it another way without inspecting the graph. The other way you could do it is, I've already said it's a completely connected graph. So we're talking about 2 of those parties. So Abed is not a connector to Abed. So
it would be n minus 2.
Between, you take away 2 from 5, you get 3. So that's another way to check. So you can either just visually check, okay, can I get from Abed to Annie via Pierce? Yes. Can I get from Abed to Annie via Troy? Yes. Can I get from Abed to Annie via Shirley? Yes. Right? There's no one else. So you can do it exhaustively by just using your eyes, or you can reason about the graph structure. Either way will arrive at the number 3. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Cool. All right. So then let's just check. In any one of these components, or in each of these components, do I have 3 summands? 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Hooray! It's sanity checks. Right. So this is one way to do these kinds of things, is just to look at the shape, especially when you have a lot of data. You want to, it's like type checking. You want to look at the shape before you start getting in the numbers. You know, does the shape look correct? So I won't do all the components. I'll just check the Annie Abed component, right? So that component. So I want to look at how often Pierce listens to Abed. That's 0.5 over how often Pierce listens to Annie. So I think I have these numbers flipped around in terms of the convention. So it should be the 0.4 and the 0.5 should be up that. But I noticed that the way I've written it here. And then the question is, so that's 0.5 over 0.4. So if just, I'll go ahead and fix this. Okay, there we go. So that's clear. So 0.5 over 0.4 does that make sense to everyone?
Yes.
Cool. Now let's look at 0.3 over 0.6. So how often does Shirley listen to Abed, 0.5, versus how often does Shirley listen to Annie, 0.6? So we're good, right?
Wait a minute. There is no 0.5 between Shirley and Abed.
No, there isn't. It's 0.3 versus over 0.6.
Oh, 0.3. Okay. Yeah.
0.6. And then how often does Troy listen to Abed versus how often Troy listens to Annie? So 0.9. Oh, I've got this upside down. I consistently did Annie the other way around, so that was a mistake. There we go. So Troy listens to Annie, 0.9. Troy listens to Abed, 0.9. So 0.5 over 0.4, 0.3 over 0.6, 0.9 over 0.9. And, you know, if we go through each of these in turn, we'll get, you know, modulo typos. We'll get these numbers in their components. I'll have to redo this because I know I changed this, so this number will change a little bit. But anyway, so that's the way you calculate esteem in the social graph amongst the different parties. Does that make sense?
Yes. And when we get the number, it's depending on the number of people in the graph, right? Because we are just summing this up.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's right. And the topology may not be connected, right? It might not be a completely connected graph, right? It might, and probably it will be sparse with densely connected components, right? If we look at the way social graphs are, most of the time, what you get is like some clique where most people know each other. And then there's a distant, there's one connector to another clique, right? And so on and so forth. That's,
but
go ahead.
Is it possible that we can somehow get the number, because this number must be recalculated when we when you connections. So
when you create new connections, you have to recreate this number. That's right. When the social graph changes, this change. That's why it's parametric on G.
Okay.
Right. And that's why it's really useful to have a compositional notion of graph. Right. As the graph changes, right? If you have an algebra on graphs, then you can say, you know, okay, well, here was the change, and so now so the G prime is equal to some formula on G using the algebra graphs, and so now you can create a formula for the delta to esteem using the formula for the delta to G. Does that make sense?
Yes. This means that we should not look just the number. We should compare the number of all the people, and then we can we can see
That's correct.
how. Okay.
That's right. This will give you a partial order on the people, right? Some people will have very high esteem. Some people will have moderate esteem. Some people will have low esteem, right? So that's
So that last component in the 4 is Abed's relative esteem over Annie.
that's
right?
correct.
And then likewise, you have the other components speaking to his relative esteem relative to somebody else. Yeah, okay.
That's correct. That's exactly right.
So this means we can calculate. We don't need to calculate this for the whole graph. We can calculate this for only part of the graph, right?
Whatever your G is, right? If your G is a subgraph of another graph, right?
Nice.
So it's parametric in G. So the nice thing is that, so for example, suppose that you were building a dApp that had that was just getting off the ground, right? And so you didn't have a lot of users, or maybe you had a lot of users, but they were very sparsely connected, and so they hadn't found each other yet, and so you didn't have good measures of esteem. Well, what you could do is you could say, well, how about I use esteem measures from Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn, and I average over those to bootstrap the notion of esteem for my dApp. Does that make sense?
Yes. So we need, what kind of information we need from Facebook or Twitter?
So you
to measure engagement, the number of messages, or
yeah. So what you'd have to get is the social graph, and then which of course you'd have to get permission to get that, right? You can't get it without users' permission. But assuming that you were able to get the social graph information, then you have to look at over some frequency, like a day or a month or whatever, how often, for example, Pierce engaged with content from Abed versus how often Abed engaged with content from Pierce. So Abed pushes something on his timeline. If Pierce likes it or just clicks on it and views it, right? Those are all measures of engagement, right? And then likewise with Abed. So if Abed, in this example, half the time Pierce is clicking on content from Abed, whereas only 1/10 of the time is Abed clicking on content from Pierce. And again, you don't have to do for example, you could just look at the total content visible between Abed and Pierce, in Pierce's feed that's visible from Abed in some unit of time. So you just look at the total content in some measure of time, and likewise with Abed. So then you can get those measures. Does that make sense?
Yes. So cool. This also covers different users' behavior, right? So someone is liking like crazy, and someone is like very
Yes, that's right. That's exactly right. All right. Well, I'm well over. The one point is that now you can look at a specific piece of content, right? And you can see how a highly esteemed user engages with that content versus over the spectrum of users. You can see how frequently a piece of content is engaged, and then you can take a weighted average with respect to esteemed users and their frequency of engagement, right? And now that gives you a measure of esteem on a piece of content from the esteem on users. Does that make sense?
This makes sense.
Cool. So now you have a completely parametric notion of esteem of users and esteem of content. And so now in terms of the DAP accelerator idea that we were talking about, you can provide these esteem numbers for content that's being pushed around a particular DAP. Coolio. I mean, there are lots of things that we could do you can normalize the numbers, right? Because here we're getting numbers above 1. So you can normalize the numbers. You can take some averages, things like that. But in general, this is the shape of the kind of calculation. And I believe it's relatively quick. It's not super complicated, even in a connected, completely connected graph like this. These kinds of arithmetic operations are blazingly fast. So it should be very, very easy to do the calculation.
Where's the accelerator app defined?
That's the Dazzle.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks so much for your time and attention and engagement. I really appreciate it. It's always useful to see how miserable I am at explaining things. It takes me several tries before I get ideas across.
Or we are miserable in our understanding.
No.
I don't agree with you.
It takes me lots and lots of tries before I get ideas across. So I really appreciate your patience. All right, folks. We'll see many of you in Dev Stand-Up in just a few minutes. Ciao.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right. See you.